For 7 years, Grace Miller served the same old man at a diner in Jackson, Mississippi. He was demanding, bitter, and most people avoided him, but Grace never turned him away. Then one day, he stopped showing up. No one knew why. And just when Grace thought she'd never learn the truth, a shocking call came that changed her life forever. Stay with us until the end, because this story will leave you speechless. And before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Life at a small-town diner often seems ordinary, but sometimes the most ordinary places hide the most extraordinary stories. Magnolia Grill in Jackson, Mississippi was one of those places. Locals came in daily for hot coffee, warm cornbread, and conversation. But for Grace Miller, the diner wasn't just a workplace. It was survival. At just 27, Grace was already carrying more weight than most people her age. She was a single mother raising her daughter in a rented apartment that swallowed nearly every paycheck. Bills stacked up like clockwork. Her dream of studying nursing stayed tucked in the back of her mind, smothered by the reality of double shifts and late nights. Yet every morning she showed up to Magnolia Grill with her hair tied back and her apron fastened tight, determined to greet customers with a smile, even when life gave her few reasons to wear one. Among the regulars at Magnolia Grill, there was one customer everyone knew, and almost everyone dreaded. His name was Thomas Reed, an 88-year-old Korean War veteran. He was tall, wiry, his back slightly bent with age, and he walked with a polished cane that struck the tile floor like a drumbeat. Folks in town called him Old Reed, and though he came every day, he was anything but easy to serve. Thomas had a reputation. He wanted his collard greens cooked down to the bone. His cornbread had to be warm but never sweet. His tea needed to be poured just right, without too much ice. And if things weren't to his liking, his voice boomed across the diner, sharp as the crack of a rifle. He'd send plates back, slam his cane, and mutter under his breath about how nobody knew how to cook anymore. Other waiters and waitresses learned quickly to avoid his booth. The cooks sighed when they saw his order slip. Customers whispered, "There he goes again," whenever he raised his voice. To most people, Thomas Reed was nothing more than a bitter old man, locked in his ways. But Grace Miller saw something different. She saw the loneliness in his eyes, the kind of loneliness that doesn't come from one bad day, but from decades of carrying unspoken weight. She had grown up hearing stories about men like him, black veterans who had served their country with courage only to return home to segregation and scorn. Men who had buried wives, lost children, and lived long enough to watch the world forget them. So, while others stayed away, Grace leaned in. Every time Thomas walked into Magnolia Grill, she greeted him the same way. "How you doing today, Mr. Reed?" No matter how curt his reply, no matter how sharp his words, she took his order with patience. She made sure his food was hot, his plate just the way he wanted, and she delivered it with a smile. Her coworkers shook their heads in disbelief. "How do you put up with him?" they asked. Grace only shrugged. "Everybody's fighting something we can't see." And so began a routine that lasted not for weeks or months, but for 7 long years. For 7 years, the rhythm never changed. Every morning, Thomas Reed came through the diner's door with his cane tapping against the floor, and every morning Grace Miller served him with the same patience and warmth. She learned his patterns better than anyone. He always sat in the same corner booth, his back to the wall, eyes fixed on the door as if he were still a soldier watching the horizon. He hummed old gospel hymns when he thought no one was listening, and no matter what, he wanted his food hot enough to burn the tongue. "Mr. Reed, if it's any hotter, it'll melt the plate," Grace would tease softly. He would only grunt in return, but she noticed he never sent her dishes back. Her coworkers couldn't understand it. "Grace, the man's impossible. He curses, he complains. Why waste your energy?" But Grace kept showing up to his table with a smile. She wasn't just serving food. She was serving dignity. Something told her he had been robbed of it too many times in life. And though Thomas never thanked her, his routine never broke. While others thought he came to Magnolia Grill for the cornbread or the greens, Grace suspected he came for something else, for her, for the quiet acknowledgement she gave him when the rest of the world turned its back. But then, one morning, the rhythm broke. The door opened, the bell above it chimed, but Thomas Reed did not come. His booth sat empty. Grace carried plates to other tables, but her eyes kept flicking toward that corner. The next day, still no Thomas. The next week, nothing. His absence was like a missing beat in a song she'd grown used to hearing. The diner felt hollow without him. Grace tried to brush off her worry. Maybe he was visiting relatives. Maybe he was under the weather. But deep down, she knew Thomas Reed wasn't the type to wander. He lived alone, and he had no family nearby. His life was routine, and that routine had vanished. Then, 2 weeks later, the diner's phone rang during her shift. The hostess called out, "Grace, it's for you." She wiped her hands on her apron and picked up the receiver. On the other end was a calm but heavy voice. "Miss Grace Miller, my name is Daniel Whitmore. I'm the attorney for Mr. Thomas Reed. I'm calling with difficult news. Mr. Reed passed away earlier this month." Grace felt her throat tighten. The voice continued, "And he mentioned you in his will. I'd like to meet with you." Her heart pounded. She had served him food for 7 years, but outside the diner, they had never spoken. About life, never shared stories, never exchanged anything beyond meals and nods. Why would she, of all people, be in his will? The lawyer's words stayed with Grace long after she hung up the phone. Thomas Reed was gone. For 7 years he had been part of her daily routine, and even if he had never thanked her, his presence had become familiar, almost grounding. Now the booth where he always sat seemed to stare at her like an empty frame, reminding her of someone she never realized she would miss. A week later, the lawyer, Daniel Whitmore, arrived at Magnolia Grill during one of her morning shifts. He was a tall man with silver hair and a worn leather briefcase. Grace felt her palms sweat as he introduced himself and asked to speak privately. She led him to an empty table, her mind racing with questions she was almost afraid to voice. "I don't understand," she said quietly. "Why me?" Daniel placed his briefcase on the table and slid out a sealed envelope. "Mr. Reed was a private man," he explained gently, "but he left instructions. This is for you." Grace's fingers trembled as she broke the seal and unfolded the paper. The handwriting was shaky, but the words were clear enough to pierce her heart. "For the years you treated me like a man when the world treated me like a burden. This is my tip for your kindness. You reminded me I was still seen." Tears welled in her eyes. She had never known what her patience had meant to him. To Grace, she had simply been doing her job with dignity. But now she understood. Her kindness had been his anchor in a world that had slowly erased him. Daniel cleared his throat and spoke with measured calm. "Mr. Reed wanted you to have $75,000 from his savings, as well as the deed to his home on Maple Street." Grace's breath caught. She could hardly process the words. The man who had never once smiled at her had left her not only his money, but the very place he called home. She pressed the letter against her chest, shaken by the realization that beneath his roughness had been a gratitude so deep he could never bring himself to say it aloud. Grace left her shift early that afternoon, the letter still folded carefully in her apron pocket. The thought of Thomas Reed's house being hers now felt almost unreal. For years she had only known him as the difficult man at the corner booth. Yet he had entrusted her with the sum of his life's possessions. With hesitant steps, she followed the lawyer to Maple Street, where a modest brick home sat quietly beneath the shade of an old pecan tree. When she opened the door, the air inside carried the stillness of a life abruptly halted. Dust floated in streaks of light cutting through faded curtains, and the smell of old paper and wood lingered in every corner. Boxes were stacked neatly against the walls, not with junk, but with treasures. Grace found stacks of jazz records, worn from years of use, their covers alive, with names she recognized: Miles Davis, John Coltrane, Duke Ellington. Beside them sat shelves of books, some military manuals, others collections of poetry. On the mantel above the fireplace rested his Korean War medals, polished carefully as if he had shined them every week. A black and white photograph of a young Thomas in uniform stood beside them, his posture proud, his eyes steady. Grace felt her chest tighten. This was the man no one at the diner had known, the soldier, the reader, the music, lover, the husband whose framed wedding portrait still stood in the hallway. His life had been rich and full once, yet in the end, he had eaten his meals alone. As she moved through the house, Grace realized what his letter had truly meant. She hadn't just been serving a customer. She had been the last witness to his life, the final person who reminded him he was not invisible. Every plate she set down, every greeting she offered had chipped away at the silence he carried, and in his own way, Thomas had chosen to thank her, not with words, but with a gift that could alter her future. Grace sat in the living room with the letter in her lap and tears running down her face. She thought of the rent notices pinned to her apartment door, the nights she had whispered apologies to her daughter, when there wasn't enough to buy new shoes, and the dream of nursing school she had pushed aside year after year. For the first time in so long, she felt that door cracking open again. Thomas Reed, the man who never smiled, had given her back her hope. In the weeks that followed, Grace's life began to shift in ways she had never thought possible. With the money Thomas left her, she paid off the debts that had clung to her like shadows. She enrolled in night classes for nursing, the dream she had once folded away in the corners of her heart. For the first time, she felt her future was not only hers to imagine but hers to claim. She and her daughter moved into Thomas Reed's home on Maple Street. The modest house, once quiet and lonely, filled with new life. The sound of her little girl's laughter echoed through the rooms, and warm lights spilled from windows that had long been dim. Grace hung Thomas's medals in a frame above the mantel, polished until they gleamed, and placed his favorite photograph, the young soldier in uniform, beside them. In the evenings she played his old jazz records, letting Coltrane and Davis fill the house with music once more. It was as if the walls were breathing again. Her daughter often asked about the man whose name was now spoken with reverence in their home. "Mama, who was Thomas Reed?" she would say, curious about the stranger whose picture hung in the living room. Grace always smiled and answered, "He was a man who taught me that kindness is never wasted. Even when someone seems hard to love, they may just be waiting for a little light." One quiet morning, after finishing her shift at Magnolia Grill, Grace walked over to the corner booth where Thomas had always sat. The table was empty, yet it felt alive with memory. She rested her hand on the worn wood, her eyes misting. For 7 years she had carried his orders, listened to his grumbles, and met his silence with patience. Now she whispered softly, almost like a prayer, "Rest easy, Mr. Reed. You're not forgotten." And in that moment, Grace realized the full truth of what Thomas had left behind. The money and the house were gifts, yes, but the real inheritance was the reminder that compassion has power. Her kindness had given dignity to an old soldier in his final days, and, in return, he had given her the chance to live with renewed strength. It was proof that even the smallest acts of humanity can echo far beyond what we ever expect. Grace's story reminds us that sometimes the most difficult people are carrying the heaviest burdens. What looks like anger or bitterness may simply be loneliness waiting for kindness to break through. By choosing patience instead of judgment, Grace not only gave dignity to an old man in his final years, but also received a gift that changed her life forever. Kindness may not always be recognized in the moment, but it is never wasted. It has a way of finding its way back to us, often when we least expect it, and in ways far greater than we ever imagined. If this story touched your heart, let us know in the comments what lesson you're taking away today. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.